Raimy Rubin, we're back. This is, I don't even know what number episode at this point, but okay, either way. How are you today?
I'm doing excellent, thank you. How are you doing, Vinny?
I am, I'm good. I'm really tired. I changed my sleep schedule a little bit, changed my running schedule a bit, and I'm complaining again at the beginning of another episode. But because you asked the question, I'm one of the people, I guess, who actually answers the question is how I'm actually doing. But I'm feeling every bit of 49 and three quarters.
All right, well, I will try and bring my youthful energy to this
Thank
episode
you.
and
I
carry us
appreciate
along
that.
the way.
I've tried to match the beard, but I'm staying away from it. Uh, um, yeah. Just like headache, coffee. I don't know. We got it all here to help me out get through today's recording. Okay. As always, let's start with our good of the week. You first, as always.
Is it me as first as always? I'm not sure.
Most of the time, yeah, because I do that little intro. Before you do your anything, as always, before that, I'm gonna have to edit that out to somehow get this episode up today. We'll see. But everyone who's listening, watching, please subscribe, and like and share the podcast, the episodes. Got a lot of good feedback, a lot of good. It's just been good. It's just been a good experience so far for everybody on all sides. Looking forward to as it continues to grow. If you have ideas about topics, guests, whatever it may be, by all means, share those with us wherever you can find us, whether that's on LinkedIn or YouTube where I post them or Spotify. Comment away, share, and get engaged in the conversation. And okay, good of the week. Go for it.
All right, so my good of the week is a fundraising writer named Julie Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
Julie Cooper is a really phenomenal fundraising writer. I nominate her this week because I subscribe to her newsletter. And she has a really nice way. She does it with her husband, Brett. And together they have a really nice way of weaving in sort of like everyday stories into broader themes that always end up having to do with fundraising. And one of the more recent newsletters that I received from her was about the Lucky Duck Jeep phenomenon. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but you heard me right. The Lucky Duck Jeep phenomenon. So apparently, this is a thing in the States where Jeep owners put rubber ducks on their dashboard. This has become like a thing. Okay, and I knew of this thing. I did not know of its origin.
It's a thing like the bobblehead kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like what?
Yeah, it's a thing like the bobblehead kind of thing.
Rubber ducks.
But it's specific to Jeep owners, and it's just rubber ducks. Right.
No judgment. No judgment here. Go for it. Okay.
So Julie looked into this because she was interested in it and did the research and Googled it and found that it came from a woman who was having a bad day, and she was a Jeep owner, and she parked in some parking lot. I think the story goes that she was parked right next to another Jeep that looked exactly like hers. And her response to her bad day was to do something kind. And she had just walked out of a store, I guess, or she went into a store and bought a bunch of things. One of the things that she purchased was a rubber duck. And she decided to leave a note for the Jeep owner that said, "Nice Jeep," with a rubber duck. As she's writing the note to this Jeep owner, this 6'5" burly dude comes over to her, sees this woman writing on his car, or writing a note, and he's like, "What's going on?" And she explains to him, she's like, "I'm a Jeep owner. I was having a bad day. Just wanted to do something nice. Wanted to give you a rubber duck. You can see my note said, 'Nice Jeep.'" And he loved it, loved it. And he posted it on social media, or she posted it on social media, whatever. And so it goes, and then it goes viral, and it becomes a thing. And Julie Cooper just connects it to fundraising in a really, I think, clever way. She gave three different examples, three different ways that it connects to fundraising. But she talked about it being something that's really, truly authentic, that this was not a manufactured gesture. This just like came from this woman's heart, and that's what allowed it to be good. She talked about how you can embrace the unexpected as a fundraiser. You can tell stories and just like embrace that unexpected way of telling stories and getting people interested in the story. And she talked about how giving feels good, which I think is probably the most obvious, most direct connection, that this woman responded to having a bad day by doing something kind. And in turn, it just sort of went from there. That snowball was pushed down the hill and was able to kind of explode into an avalanche of good, where now people do this all the time and hopefully put smiles on people's faces. They put their rubber ducks on their Jeep dashboards and go on their merry way. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Julie. I thought it was a very clever way of connecting these sort of everyday stories, everyday things going on to fundraising in ways that we can keep it front and center of our mind.
Sweet. Weird, but sweet. Okay. I
Yeah.
thought you were going to go like with the rubber. There's that whole thing with like the duck tour kind of thing where.
Yes, the rubber duck is on tour. The rubber duck, I've seen the rubber duck in person, the giant rubber.
So that's something else. Okay.
That's something else.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. My good of the week is I'm hoping at we may have mentioned them a couple of times, but I'm going to bring it in here. The Savannah Bananas. Have we talked about
Yes.
them before?
I only know of them from you, and I think you have mentioned them on the podcast. But
So I'm going to mention them again. They're going to be my good of the week this week. I watched a presentation from the founder and owner of the Savannah Bananas. I think his name is Jeff Cole. You can't miss the guy. He always wears the yellow suit with the yellow hat, and he looks like a banana.
Okay.
Phenomenal what he's done with the business, what they've done, and so over the weekend they played in their first NFL football stadium.
Well, why don't you tell our listeners who the Savannah Bananas are, just in case they haven't.
So the Savannah Bananas, I think the bad way of explaining them is that they're the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball. I think a lot of people think that that's what they are. Maybe they started out that way. They're sort of like, I feel like a kitschy kind of niche, fun baseball experience, let's call it that. But they've now expanded into what they call Banana Ball, is their own version of baseball. What he has explained was if the Harlem Globetrotters had created their own league, that's sort of what it. So it's a lot of gags and it's a lot of fun. It's a completely different experience. So anyway, so they played their first NFL stadium over the weekend, like 65, 70,000 people in the stadium to watch these guys play non-Major League Baseball. So obviously people are enjoying it, going for the experience. So I watched this talk that he gave about customer experience and how they think about everything from the customer experience perspective, and 3 words. You wouldn't believe. Okay, that's the whole, like, the basis of the entire thing is you wouldn't believe, right? And so the thinking is that a person leaves the Savannah Banana experience and they go and they tell people, you wouldn't believe this happened and you wouldn't believe that happened. He said, and just that alone drive so much of their innovation, but also so much of the excitement around what they do. And so their whole thing is tied into the customer experience. So I listened to this thinking about the donor experience, which we haven't talked about yet on the podcast, but the idea of how do you improve the donor experience such that it either brings larger gifts or it brings additional gifts into an organization. And so he started to go through a lot of things around the donor experience. And I just thought that's such an interesting subject, and it just sort of got my head rolling. And he had this idea about called what the 5 E's is sort of how they sort of how they sort of snowballed from there. Well, snowball's not the right term, but how they rolled from there. So super interesting talk uh, that he gave. It was to a group of lawyers who are not known for their customer experience, which was made it even more interesting. I just, shout out to the Savannah Bananas who are making baseball interesting and fun in a very different and unique way, and putting a product out on the table, which I think a lot of people would have thought never would be real, but thinking about it in a very different way, and makes you just want to think about these things all together differently.
Yeah, that's really. I mean, I love that so much because I think it's very hard for people. It's certainly hard for me. I'll project a little bit and say it's hard for other people also to look at something that exists and then reimagine it in a different way. And I think that's true of baseball. I think it's definitely true of donor experience, where we get in sort of this mindset of we know what the giving experience looks like. We know what the thank you experience looks
Yeah.
like, and therefore we're very much constrained, and we're not creative, and we're not innovative, and we're not thinking about how can we make this memorable. What was it? Could you believe? Well,
You wouldn't believe. You
you
wouldn't
wouldn't
believe.
believe, right? So we don't think about that in terms of fundraising, and I think it's once we start to, I bet the ideas would start flowing and it wouldn't be difficult to make it just such a memorable experience.
Yeah, there's a couple of people that I know who basically their business is to create the events for nonprofits that are mind-blowing event experiences. So they do wrap their brain around how to make that speech at that dinner something you can actually sit through. They think through the walk-in. How do you walk into a building? Like they have the whole thing visioned out, and and so they're thinking about donor experience. There are a couple of organizations off the top of my head that think about donor experience, so that their events are much better, which then breeds what it wants to be. So, excuse me. Uh, so it just fit into that, and so just got my head rolling around a lot of ideas about that subject, and I think it became just in my head something that I've been like obsessing about over the last couple of days as a subject that's worth a long conversation, probably with an expert or two who really appreciate the back end of thinking that all the way through and then are executing on that too. But anyway, yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that. I think it'd be interesting to have that conversation with an expert. And I think it'd be an interesting exercise just for us to go through and say, what does like a mind blowing, memorable donor experience look like? Be very cool.
Yeah, I don't want to overdo this, but just to belabor it for just a minute here. When I was working in synagogue work, one of the things I used to do with synagogues is I would have them walk through other synagogues as a consulting exercise. I would have them, because they couldn't envision and see their own synagogue with fresh eyes, I would have them go to another synagogue in their community or nearby to experience what walking into that space would be like and all the things that they notice about that new space, and then come back and then watch their own space in just from this fresh eyes, right? Or bring fresh eyes into their building to see all the things that they maybe not paying attention to. And I didn't make it up. I got it from a book on churches. Churches, there's just amazing literature that they put together on a lot of these things, and their welcoming experience was just so powerful. So there was a book that I read about the first time a person walks into a church, right? So how did the pastor figure out how to do this? Is the pastor came one Sunday as a first time member, parked all the way at the back of the parking lot, and went through the entire experience, taking mental notes the entire way through, and then reimagined the entire experience differently and changed everything. Like it was not a subtle change, but it was subtle enough that people didn't exactly appreciate it, but it dramatically changed how welcome people felt, sorry, and it massively increased their new member numbers because people heard about how good the welcome experience was from the walk up from the parking lot to the information desk at the front to the coffee bar on the side. And I was like, oh man, like that was just genius. And so in some spaces we think about these things, how to make that experience better. In other places we don't. So the donor experience is probably not one that we do, but in other spaces and other places that we probably both experienced where, wow, that was a good customer experience. So
Sure.
long intro to this week's episode, but
I like it. I like it.
but sets up another episode at some point in the future. Okay, so today, the good, the bad, the ugly of nonprofit leadership. We're going to talk about the things that, and from our perspective, in our minds, make up good nonprofit leadership and make up less than good. It's the nicest way to say that. Nonprofit leadership as well. I will ask you the question. No names are going to get thrown out into this conversation. Have you ever worked with someone who you would say would be memorable as a leader, but not in a good way?
I would say that I wouldn't say it's such a blanket statement. I would say there have been certain qualities in certain leaders that I've worked with that I felt there's a lot of room for improvement. I don't know that I've worked with anyone who just, like got poor grades across the board, but I've seen organizational leaders. I can give you one example if we're going to start on the negative side is I've dealt with one organizational leader comes to mind who's excellent at his job, really, really excellent. The thing that I always bothered me was that he was so busy and legitimately so that he did not have a lot of time to update his staff, update donors about what was going on. So he would go to conferences or conventions, or days or weeks would go by, and there would be things happening, but information wasn't filtered down, and it wasn't something that he prioritized. And I remember speaking to him about it, and in a group of people, we asked him if there was a way that we could make it easier for him to give people more information that they could disseminate it. And I don't remember what his exact words were, but they amounted to like, no, like I'm busy, like I got other stuff to do, and in my long list of priorities, updating the staff is not one of them. And I was just thinking to myself, all right, if I ever do a podcast on qualities that a nonprofit leader should have, this is going to
Sure,
go
that's
on.
what you were thinking.
So that's an example. But again, I can go on and on about the amazing things that this person did during his very busy hours. It was an aspect, a much larger picture.
Super like PC of you to split between overall bad leader and bad qualities of a good leader, in the nicest way that you could think of it. Okay, fine, that's fair. I kind of appreciate that. There, most often there are good qualities there, even with people who we might find to be, overall, let's say if we had to grade them, um, not the best leaders in the world. Um, Before we get into some specifics, that was I think is on my list of, not good. I was struck by a question that in preparing, which was, are there differences between the good, the bad, the ugly in the nonprofit world versus the good, the bad, the ugly in the for-profit world? It's like I know it's a jumping off point, but it just struck me as an interesting question. Do we grade them? Do we view them differently? Do we think about them differently? Something that would fly in a business doesn't fly in a nonprofit. Something that doesn't fly in a nonprofit flies in a business. That kind of thing.
There's one difference that comes to mind, and I don't know that it's a significant one. And that is, I think that nonprofit professionals, generally speaking, feel more underappreciated than professionals, employees working in the for-profit sector. And I think a lot of that has to do with compensation, right? That true or not, and I'm sure it's totally case specific, that nonprofit professionals are not always paid what they should be. And I think that to me is the one difference between, not that all employees who work for for-profit companies are paid what they should either, but there's less of that stigma, and there's certainly less of that people fall back on. And because of that, one of the things that I was thinking of in doing my homework for this episode, and is on my list, I wouldn't say it's number one, but it's on my list of five that I put together, is really just appreciating the staff, and empowering them. And I think that might be a little bit more necessary in the nonprofit space, just because I think a lot of employees come to it with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, like we could be making more if we were working in the corporate sector. So therefore, appreciate us and be able to repay us somehow, even if you're not able to do that with actual money. There are plenty of other ways that you can make people feel appreciated in your job.
The one that I like that. We'll get to that also. The one that I was that kept coming up for me was that in the nonprofit environment, I feel often that like a nonprofit leader will accept less from
Interesting.
people on the team than in the business environment because it's a nonprofit. They'll be willing to, from let's say someone on the team in terms of their performance, in terms of let's say a due date, getting things done on time, people not exactly fitting into their role, but it's a nonprofit, so we're like, we're a nonprofit in the nonprofit space too. So I feel like, and it's larger than just the leadership, but I think it sits with leadership that because it's a nonprofit, we're willing to accept, um, lesser quality than we would if it was a business trying to, you know, make a dollar, make another dollar, sell another widget kind of a thing.
That's a really interesting one, and I would widen it a little bit. It was not something I thought of, but it makes a lot of sense that it could be that there's a little bit more just complacency in general in the nonprofit space because it's a safer space, because in a lot of ways innovation is frowned upon in the nonprofit space, right? We don't want money to be going to something experimental. We want money to be going to something that we know is going to work. Is generally the mindset that people have.
Yeah.
they're not, I'd say this is certainly true of established nonprofits. They're not living and dying by their revenue stream, by the bottom line. They're getting donations. So therefore, in terms of providing that service, there's less sense of urgency, I think, to change, to be innovative, to cut bait with an employee who's not fulfilling his or her duties. Like I think there's that definitely could be. It's not something I thought of prior to this, but it certainly makes sense.
Yeah, and when I started to think about the subject more and started thinking about some of my less great leadership moments personally, uh, I remember I remember getting heated with a guy on my team years ago about something. He just disappeared for a day, of an important day. Just disappeared. Wasn't reachable, wasn't accessible to anybody, and it was gone, completely gone, off the radar. The next day, game came back. We really had it out, and he was not only surprised by just sort of my tone, just in terms of that space, but that was even okay at all to be disappointed or upset or frustrated or annoyed and share that with somebody in sort of in a very emotive and emotional manner, because we don't do that here. That kind of approach. And I was saying, like, I don't care that we like you haven't done that here before. Like, you got to be held accountable, and this is how you get held accountable is by someone telling you you did something wrong here. That's how you get better. So, like, it was just for me that was fell into that same box of what we're willing to and not willing to accept. And I maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like it's different in the nonprofit space than in the for-profit space. Anyway, but
It
it was
could
just
be.
sort of like my first thought in thinking about the subject.
It could be. If I can flip that on its head, and I'll give you my the first thing that I came up with as I was thinking about the good and what a good
Good, yeah.
nonprofit leader has is I think the flip side of the example that you just gave, and I know you gave it about yourself, so this is no not bashing Benny in a previous professional life here, but I think a good nonprofit leader paints a really clear vision for where we're going as a team, as a community, and maps a path there, right? They're able to articulate where the organization is headed and lays out really practical steps and is inspiring and pushing it there. And I think that when you're able to do that and sort of like galvanize a staff, galvanize a volunteer group, if it's made up of volunteers, then you're able to push it forward. You get people really committed to a cause. And I think that that's a way to, I don't know, counter some of that fatigue that a lot of nonprofit professionals have, a lot of that instinct to stagnate, right? Like it's motivation, it's inspiration, it's showing people where we can go when we all work together as a team. It's that really like that head coach rah rah halftime speech thing going on, but on a really consistent basis because it's tiring and it's easy to check out and it's easy to say I'm not getting paid enough. So I think a good nonprofit leader really puts that vision out in front and center and says, "This is where we're going. This is how we're going to get there. Now let's go do it together."
Yeah, my number one actually is related, but to use the term adjacent to what you're describing there, which is very much mission first, mission driven, and being to some degree rigorous to the mission and not allowing for mission drift and not allowing for it to get out of hand and not allowing it to just sort of just lose focus and flow, but really keeping people on that mission. And that comes to the inspiration part that you mentioned. It comes to the passion part, which I think is related to a lot of these different things. But it's really important. It's and the emotional side, it's like the passion and the inspiration. And then being mission driven on the other side of that is avoiding mission drift and also really tying back everything that's going on back to mission. Is this part of our mission? Is that task part of what we're doing? Is that program tied into our mission? Is it beyond the scope and therefore we're not going to do it? So for me, number one on the leader side for great nonprofit leaders is they embody the mission, they live the mission. That's not saying that every leader is gonna be that. That's not always the case because sometimes you get a leader who just they're an operator. You don't get the sense from them that they're mission driven. They're just good at their job, right? But I think that the ones that really stand out are the ones that really are mission driven first.
Let me ask you, in your experience, I don't know that I've come across, I'm certainly familiar with the concept and have seen mission drift. It's not like it's something totally foreign to me, but just the way you were talking, it makes it sound to me like you've had experience where that's really gone awry, where there's been serious mission drift that's been that's been damaging to the organization.
Yeah, I've seen programs and organizations in a lot of places that like they're adding layers and projects to what they do that makes sense financially. So it hits a donor and the donor wants to do something and it's sort of kind of whatever they do, but not exactly. And they'll justify it because it's a big donor and they'll take the gift. And what ends up happening is it dilutes what they're doing overall. It changes some of their marketing and their PR around who they are as an organization. So you see and you're like, who are those guys again? Like, what exactly do they do? And 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 then the leader, I think, very often starts to suffer because they had a need, whatever that was, financial, let's say, and they compromised to a degree, and as a result, they're not happy, and they're doing things they don't want to do. And so I've seen that happen. And it happens too often, and sometimes it just, in my case, I'll come into an organization, I'll ask that question, "What do you do?" And they'll tell me what they do. And I say, okay, if that's what you do, then why are we doing A, B, C, X, Y, Z? Like, how does that fit to what you do? Is that tied to your mission? And then when they say it, a lot of the time they hear it, and a lot of the time they don't want to acknowledge that, okay, that's beyond the scope and the pale of what we are. And I was like, okay, so like how do you the question then becomes practical is like, okay, how do we excise ourselves from that or move away from that or cut that loose and move into the direction that we really want to be in, we can really focus on our work. But mission drift is a real problem, I think, for organizations because of most often it's a financial issue. They need the money. They're willing to expand a little bit, and it dilutes the water.
And I think that navigating that relationship with a donor, if you have to say no or you're in the middle of a project and it's not working out, I think that's a whole conversation in and of itself. Also, how you're able to maintain a relationship with someone
Yeah,
who's giving you a lot of money, but you might not be able to say yes to their every request.
super hard to do. It's, you're sitting on the possibility of, let's say, a large gift or a repeat gift, and you have to say no. Like, you have to say no. But there are a lot of ways to say no. And like, I actually think the opposite. If you're sitting with a donor in that situation, if you're really honest with them about why you're saying no, what are the reasons here, list them out. And fundamentally, it's just not who we are. But there's a great organization that I'm happy to introduce you to. It's a totally different subject, but that I'm happy to connect you with the leader who will be thrilled to pieces to get a new donor, right? But not,
Yeah,
not ours. So I think that for me is a big one. So I feel like as we go through this a little further, we're going to see that our good and our bad are just
sure,
the mirror opposite
absolutely.
of what we're talking about. But your first one here is like vision, right? Being able to lay out the vision, clarity on the vision. My first one here is on a mission, and so those are related to each other.
All right, you want to go next? What's your number two?
Yeah, my number two is the relationship guy, mastering relationships, because a lot of what makes for good nonprofit leadership is someone who has an uncanny ability to manage and balance a host of different kinds of relationships with a lot of different audiences at the same time. You talked in an earlier episode about the idea that business is one sort of relationship. So you're in a business and you sell a widget, you sell whatever you sell, the salesperson or the business owner and the client, and that's the whole thing, right? Maybe there's some vendors around that. But in the nonprofit space where you're talking about the person who's the beneficiary of the work that you do, and you have a donor who's another, and then you have a board member, and then you have an employee, and you have a team, you're balancing and you're managing, in some cases manipulating a lot of different relationships at the same time. And so being really good in those spaces with all those different groups is incredibly hard. When you see someone who's really good at it, it's like a masterwork to watch them operate in a room, in a space, and then switch spaces and still be amazing. Just an example, there's a guy I know, he runs a very large nonprofit, happens to be in the United States now, who I saw in a room with like a handful of colleagues, people who were very similar to the roles. They were also executives in organizations, but he commanded the space. And then he went out and gave a presentation to 200 random people that he had never met before. And he was super comfortable there. Then I went out with him into the neighborhood where we were staying. He walked into a store, and you would have thought he knew the owner for 50 years, just the way in which he had been able to just manage and just be super smooth and comfortable in all those different environments. I was exhausted just watching him. He was amazing, amazing.
So let me ask you on that, because I have a little bit of an issue. Not that I think it's a bad one to have on the list. In fact, it's on mine as well. But as I was putting it together, I'm thinking to myself, how do you get good at this? It sort of feels like it's one of those innate traits that either you got it or you don't. And that I don't want to accept that, right? Because I don't got it. So like if I want to become that, what can you do?
It's a great question. I don't. We talked in one of our earlier episodes with Jeremy Stern, who described himself as the extrovert's extrovert. Right? He loves the game. He loves the interaction. I don't. I really don't. And I think I've told you I'd rather just sit by myself somewhere quietly reading a book or not doing nothing than be in a large room. One of the things that tricks for me that I do that I learned from somebody else is two things. One, I get myself mentally prepared for going into those spaces. So it's not natural for me to want to be there, and I don't love them, but I mentally have to like flip a switch. And I know that when it's over, I'm going to be exhausted, but I mentally have to flip a switch to go into those spaces. And I know also that I do get comments from people who know me well, like, "Wow, you were really you were really on today." Like, oh, thank you very much. But it's a conscious effort on my part to try to really be really in and really focused. Um, at the same time, I do two other things. One, I pick like a few people and I talk to only those people in those rooms. So I don't go to talk and glad hand 500 people. I'll never be successful at that, no matter what I'm doing. But I'll work around to a couple of people. So I'll usually start with somebody I know if I can, because then I feel comfortable better in the space. Maybe they'll introduce me to somebody. And I can also get out of that conversation to another one. They won't feel bad. That's usually something that I do. So I'm only going to end up trying to meet like three people, but it feels like I made my way through the entire room, even though I didn't. That's really one. And then the other thing that I think I'm pretty good at generally, I'm a pretty good listener. So I'm interested, I'm curious when I'm in a conversation with someone. So if it's one-on-one like this, or just in presence of somebody physically, I pay attention pretty well. So that for me in that space really works. I can really key in on somebody and really listen. I haven't yet worked out all the kinks of switching to another conversation or flipping from donor to board member to a fellow employee to alum who's, whatever. Like that was always hard and still hard, but that's how I've learned how to do it. But admittedly, I still don't love it. There are some people who love it and are great at it, and they're just so smooth. Like they're just like it feels like they're dancing just through that whole room, and it's like beautiful to watch.
It's interesting. So I don't know if I've talked on these podcasts, on these episodes about my dad too much, but my dad, when I was a kid growing up, my dad owned a suit store, and he was competing with some of the much larger operations, the chains that were could certainly beat him on price. So how did he stay in business for as long as he did? He won on customer service, and he is like the master of customer service. And one of the things that I used to see him do all the time, both at the store and out and about when we would walk on the street or whatever it was, is he's really present in conversations. He's like really present, which is a really admirable quality. But he was really good at remembering people's names. And I talked to him about it, and he's also not naturally good at it. He came up with a trick for himself where when he met someone, he would work the person's name into the conversation. He would say the person's name back to them like three times over the course of the conversation, which is a little bit awkward, but it's better than to be just that little bit awkward. Be like, hey, Bini, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
to say the person's name, and by saying it three times, but he would remember people's names, and it works for him. And it was really amazing because I remember being at the store a bunch of times, and someone would walk in, and basically the deal that my dad had with his staff and himself was that if it was a repeat customer, the salesperson who waited on that person last time remembers that person's name. And they were all really good at it. You would walk in the door and they would be like, hey, Raimy, nice to see you again. And, the customer would be like, I haven't been here for 2.5 years. Like, yeah, but we remember, and it was those types of things. It's that. So as we're talking, it's like I think it is a little bit innate, but there are definitely things that people can do to improve those skills, exercise those muscles, to be present in conversations, to remember people's names, to be able just to like talk and be there.
Yeah. So we're going to move on, but here's two quick
Okay.
ones on that. One, in certain spaces, going into certain rooms, I also prepared. So if
Mm.
I knew who the audience was going to be, I'd make a beeline for certain people because I knew they were going to be there, right? And that helped a lot because it helped me focus on a specific part of the audience. You can't get to everybody, but I can work my way quickly to somebody. That was really one. Two, I do remember all the names and all the faces and all the places. It's a weird sort of quirk that a couple times my wife has told me to stop reminding people when and where I met them because it's a little crazy. Like it gets like, oh no, I met you here and there. Like, why do you remember that? And I remember it, and
Creepy.
it can be creepy. Yes, so I've stopped mostly doing it. Partially also at this stage of my life, I don't always remember all the places, and so it sounds weird to say it and then not remember. Like you just get so like don't do that. Those are two. The third one though with my wife is also really really key. Is if we're in a space, she's amazing at this. Like amazing in these rooms, people, whatever. But if I don't remember the person's name and she's standing there for an introduction, like within a second we have a cue, right? That basically, so she just introduces herself, and then boom, like it just, or I'll do, or the reverse, and I'll just introduce myself, I'll put out a hand and handshake, and then we're in the conversation. We get there really quick. So, for me, that this whole thing about mastering relationship in the nonprofit space, it's not unique to nonprofits. In the business space, just like you described with your dad and his team, mastering the ability to own the customer relationship and really be good at those relationships is just such a gift. I think it overwhelms so many other faults that a person can have, is the ability to really master those relationships. That's my number two.
Awesome. Awesome. My next one is to empower the team, and
Yeah.
really through trust and appreciation, but also like empowering. It was a tricky one for me to come up with the right words for this, and I don't know that I nailed it, because it's on the one hand you want to go and let them do their jobs, and on the other hand it ties back to my number one, where you want to lay out the roadmap for them. You want to be there for them as they're doing their job and encountering challenges, and then you're there to say, okay, how can I help you overcome this obstacle that's in your way now? I think a lot of it just has to do with recognizing hard work, showing genuine appreciation, listening to them, having those conversations where you're again really listening to what they're saying and maybe what they're not saying, so that you can go and overcome those obstacles in your way, and just letting people feel value. Because again, oftentimes nonprofit work, I think, can feel a little thankless, and people want to feel appreciated. And I think if they do, then they'll stick around. They'll be invested in it. They'll all of these things tie together if it's mission driven, and if you're laying out that groundwork for them, and if you're listening to them, then you're going to empower them to be able to go and do their job.
Agreed. Agreed. This is actually number four on my list, but no one likes to work for a micromanager. No one anywhere ever likes to work for a micromanager. It just, someone who's going to check your work after, or to hold you accountable to your responsibilities and your goals is one thing, but someone who's going to nitpick to death the work that you're doing and how you're doing it, like that is not an enjoyable experience whatsoever. And as you said, it doesn't slide into being about the vision. It's about very much about it being my way, how to do this, and not giving people the space. And so they don't buy in, right? When you do it that way, people don't feel they don't feel a sense of ownership. They're not your partners. They're just, you know, not to use to overstate it, but like it feels a little bit more like a slavish kind of a mentality about the work, and nobody wants to be in that, even for the right paycheck. Nobody wants to be in that space, and at some point you grow tired of it. And so so I think that empowering people, empowering the team, trusting the team, right, giving them the space to be creative and free in their ability as to how they're going to do the work and how they're going to get it done, I think is a great trait for a leader. I have found in my experience in coaching people, like people often are asking me, well, how should we do this? So I'm like, I don't care. how you do it. Like it's not my role as the coach to tell you how to do it. Certainly never. But even like if I was in charge of your team as an employee, as a director of a team, I still wouldn't tell you how to do it. I want to give you the space to, to get creative rather than, be the one who's dictating out tasks and roles and how you're going to do everything. Like I'm much more interested personally in the goals ultimately, and that it's done efficiently and effectively more than I'm interested in exactly how you got there. And I want you to feel like you got there how you wanted to get there. So I definitely hear that. For me, that's a super important piece of great leadership. Again, I don't think it's unique to nonprofits, but I think your point, which is sort of a through line here so far, is that there's a there's a fundamental difference between business and nonprofits, and therefore these things come across differently and are experienced differently. Or maybe when you're putting them on a sort of a scale, it's a different scale in how you think about it because it's nonprofit as for profit.
Sure. And the other thing that comes to mind now in terms of a difference is I've worked with a lot of different organizations, and a lot of them are there's a lot of work by committee, right? There's a lot of work by committee, probably more so than in the for-profit sector, because you're going to have active boards, because you're going to have volunteers and committees in and of themselves. And one thing that I've seen good nonprofit leaders do is have the hard conversations internally before the meeting, so that you're not airing dirty laundry, that you don't have a disagreement among staff members in the big meeting with the board, with the committees. I think there's a certain amount of consensus building that
Yeah,
needs to happen at these things. And I think good nonprofit leaders don't shy away from hard conversations, but they have the right time and place to do them, so that when you're walking into a situation, there's fewer surprises, right? There's fewer surprises when you do have the big conversation.
right. I wanted to make sure that we have enough time for the other side of this
Yeah,
conversation.
sure, sure, sure.
We've only gotten to four on the good side. There are many more that I had on my list as well, but in the interest of time and the podcast, to move over to the other side of this, which admittedly, typically speaking, I think people come to faster. They are always faster to sort of list out their negatives as opposed to their positives. But I'll give you the space here. Give me the first thing on your list that is like flashing sign of run for the hills. This is not a good leader.
So, as you indicated earlier, I think a lot of these are mirror images of one another. My first one is when there's not a clear vision of where we're going. I think that is really hard for staff. I think it's hard
Mhm.
for donors. You want to be able to lay out for donors just as much for staff what success looks like. And if you're not able to do that, I think it gets tricky. I think it gets really tricky. And I've seen it. I've seen it in organizations that don't have a clear roadmap for what success looks like. It's tricky.
How do they survive?
I don't know, because oftentimes there's enough good, and if you check 4 out of these 5 boxes but don't hit all five, then generally you're going to be okay, right? It's not totally zero sum, but I think there'd be a lot more efficiency, a lot more clarity around the work if you're able to lay out a roadmap for people and say, this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get
I got it. Yeah, no, I definitely hear that. To me, it comes back to what you said earlier. Maybe they're related. First thing you mentioned was bad, like poor communication, right, internally to the team or however he's talking about that kind of stuff. To me, I feel like those things are related to each other. Inability to communicate properly to the team or to whoever, whether that's the vision or accomplishments or you name whatever comes after that, to me like is a major red flag in an organization that just like I don't want to be part of an organization where I don't know what's going on or it's not clear or it's like
right. Right. If you have to
ambiguity.
chase down information from people, it's not a good situation.
Yeah, by the way, just on that point, what you said earlier, I remember I worked in a place years ago. I was like a senior person at the organization. I'd meet a lot of different people. There was board members, donors, colleagues, whatever. And one of my board members said to me, if you don't take a picture, it didn't happen. Right? That was his rule. Because he's like, you could tell me about all these meetings and they're great. He said, but I'm telling you, if I can't visually see the meeting in some way, it didn't happen. So, so, so at every meeting with all these people, I would selfie, like by the door, by in a restaurant, right? And it was so not my personality. like I'm so not interested in putting my face on the screen. But I knew that he needed to see it. And he said, he goes, look, is that he needed to see it. He felt like other board members would want to see it too. And I began to get the point, which to the point about communication that you mentioned before, is I started an internal newsletter for the board to communicate what I was doing so that they didn't have questions about what I was doing in the role all the time. So they get, a brief and a write up and then like 40 pictures of meetings, right? They're like, oh, he's busy. Like he's doing something,
I mean, do you feel like that's a healthy?
Communicating with the board and leadership in some sort of a newsletter-ish kind of an idea, I think is a great idea. The picture thing has its pluses and its minuses. But I got the point as to what he was trying to make. And I make that point to a lot of people also. I talk to a lot of leaders and tell them they should have leadership newsletters to communicate more activity. It doesn't have to have selfies with your donors or selfies with your board members, but it can have a healthy approach to communicating more activity than less.
Yeah, I don't. The only word I disagree with is the word activity. I think because activity isn't the goal, right? Whatever the outcome is the goal.
Outcomes, yeah. Outcomes are part of that conversation. About a part of that too. There's a guy I was just working with recently as a coach, and one of the things I had him do was every week he'd sum up the number of meetings he had, the number of conversations he had, because he was new to his position. He was dealing with a fairly aggressive board, and I wanted him to show that he was on top of the work and that he was progressing, the things were getting done. And if he went to the weekend and didn't share, I was deeply concerned for him that by Sunday, they would be flipping out that he hadn't communicated what he was doing. So over the course of a few weeks, he was able to show that he had spoken to 50 donors, he had reached out to 20 parents, he had talked to 7 board members, and and X number of solicitations were made and X number of donations came in, right? Just that on a document is a major improvement over nothing, right? And for the person themselves and the ability to communicate that out, because as organizations grow, right? If you're a team of 3, it's one thing. If you're a team of 100 and there's a lot of things going on, there's a lot of departments, a lot of teams. So the lack of communication that can go on in an organization in that space, people just don't know what's going on. They're just not aware of everything that's happening. And you as the leader are responsible to make sure, and it helps keep people close to the mission and focused, one, but just like they can actually talk about what's going on at the organization, even if it's not their own role in the organization. So like that kind of communication for me relates back to it's not exactly the same point about vision, but it is about the ability to move everybody forward in the same direction, is communicating properly in all those spaces and all those places.
I get that. I get that. That makes a lot of sense. What was your number one red flag?
Ego over mission. There are too many people that fit that box that I have seen and come across and run away from when the opportunity presented itself. And admittedly, 1 or 2 times where I actually walked right into that fire knowingly, in terms of just either working with someone or working for someone, but ego before mission. They're prioritizing themselves, they're prioritizing their personal recognition over the organization's success. It's hard because in a world where social media is really important and views and being the leader, making sure that your board and your donors feel like the leader is leading, it's hard to uh, accept the second chair when you're the leader. However, if you're able to take a step back and play chess and really help move all the pieces and get people into those other positions and help other people succeed, you end up far better. But ego over mission for me is a huge one, and I've lived it. Meaning, like I remember I worked in a place, I thought I had a really good idea. The person I was working for crushed it, just crushed the idea. I was like, okay, that was tough. And then a week later, presented the idea as their own, and I didn't know where to hide. I was like, did that just happen? Like, how did that happen? Like, but it did. And I was like, okay, I learned my lesson. It was like, no more ideas. Like, don't put them out there unless, but that for me is a huge thing.
Yeah, and I get the temptation for it because especially in a relationship driven business sector like the nonprofit sector is, there's it I think it's easy to sort of misconstrue the fact that the more mighty that I appear, the stronger my organization appears, the mightier the organization appears. So, the more that I self promote, the more that I put myself out there and show all of the accomplishments, all of the good ideas, everything
Yeah.
it might not necessarily be coming from the worst place in the world, but certainly the implementation of lifting your organization up and showing everyone the amazing things that are happening in there. The execution is definitely not there for that. So I get that. It's a great one.
Yeah, you definitely end up, and I would say most of the time, I don't think it's malicious. Like I don't think, but sometimes it is. That person is coming at it from a very malicious perspective, and that can be, you know, maddening. Um,
Yeah,
and in the world that we live in now, where attention, it's an attention economy on some level, to use a horrible term, but that's the term that a lot of people use. So yeah, getting views and getting your face in these kinds of things is, that's how people know that I'm doing something. Right?
yeah, yeah.
That's my number one.
We have time for one more.
I think we have, if we go fast, we have time for two more. How about that?
All right, fine. So I'll give you my next one. I think a red flag is a nonprofit leader who talks more than they listen.
Mm.
That's what I put because I was even thinking about one of our previous episodes where we talked about the first things that each of us would do when we put together when we started an organization, and I think both of
Yeah,
us came down to putting together a board or just a group of champions, and that's true whether you're starting an organization or whether you're dealing with a 100-year-old organization. We're only as strong as the people that are around us, and
right.
it's a problem if you are not listening to your board. It's a problem if you're not listening to your donors. It's a problem if you're not listening to your staff. You have to be able to just be receptive to what they're seeing, what they're doing. A lot of these people are closer to the work than the CEO often.
Right.
So
Right.
all the more so, these people are your eyes and ears on the ground. And if you are not receptive to what they're saying and not letting them do their job, then I think it's just a recipe for failure.
Totally agree. And the last one I'll share here, just because we're basically out of time, for the time frame that we've set up for this, is paralysis around decision making. To me, again, it's not different so much from other environments and other spaces, but like analysis paralysis, avoiding the tough calls, not wanting to make those tough decisions, unwilling to take risk or calculated or careful risk where it's possible, to me is like, I don't want to be part of that. Like I want someone who's gonna, you know, take it by the horn, someone who's gonna push the envelope a little bit, someone who's gonna make mistakes but make a decision and make it, and go. But when it becomes that analysis paralysis kind of an idea, and it becomes a space where they're afraid to, bump into the walls or bump heads against anything, whatever that is, to me, like that's a bad sign on the leadership side. And I get being careful and I get being, you know, smart about a lot of these things. But at the same time, like I tell people all the time, there's risk on both sides of these things. There's a risk in making the decision, there's a risk in not making the decision. There's a decision in making the decision, and there's a decision by indecision, to say that the right way. So I think those things are really, to me, is a huge red flag when you meet someone and you see that they're incapable or unwilling to make a tough decision, then yeah,
Yeah,
that's a real flag for me.
yeah, that's another very, very good one.
Okay, so we covered a lot. There are a lot more, and I would encourage people to share their bad experiences with leaders, not by name or by organization,
They
but
could be
also the
could be good experiences too. Send us your
or
good
the good. Right,
experiences.
there are good too, of course. There are good as well. Share the additional ones. There are so many more good traits of really good leaders, and unfortunately, there's so many things on the other side that people can really work on and fix and learn to improve upon, to become much better leaders. And I would say for 99% of these skill sets, they're learnable, they're coachable. If a person is willing and open to learning and to study and to the critique and to the coaching, they can always get better at every single one of these things, or learn a trick, or learn a tool, or learn a skill, or learn a practice that gets them over the hump to become better at all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Certainly improvement.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Feel better. I love the raspy voice. Really great on you. You made it through today's episode. Appreciate that. You really worked it today.
Thank you. My voice only cracked about a dozen times, so we're okay.
No, I fix it in the editing. Okay.
All right.
We will leave it there, Raimy. Take care.
Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.